Alrighty, let's continue our discussion of the endocrine system and the main signaling molecule, or really the only signaling molecule from the endocrine system, which are known as hormones. And there certainly are neurohormones, which are just a variation on that theme that we'll talk about. The focus here is really going to be on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and some other downstream organs and glands that they impact. To be clear, the hypothalamus is part of a region in the brainstem known as the diencephalon. To be clear, some people do include the diencephalon within the brainstem, or some consider it a different aspect of it, but it's not part of the cerebral hemispheres. It's immediately above the midbrain. If that means nothing to you, don't worry about it. But in lavender here, this is representing the hypothalamus. And descending from the hypothalamus, we have a pea-sized shaped organ known as the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland comes in two varieties, or two regions of the pituitary gland: the anterior pituitary, otherwise known as the adenohypophysis. This is composed of epithelial tissue, and this is what's described as being a classic endocrine organ because it is produced by endocrine tissue, whereas the posterior pituitary is composed of nervous tissue. And that's why I think it's a good idea to understand the alternative name for the posterior pituitary, which is the neurohypophysis. If you remember the posterior pituitary is referred to as the neurohypophysis, then that should help us remember, or help you remember, that it's composed of nervous tissue. And there's no coincidence I have the posterior pituitary outlined in lavender in the same color as the hypothalamus, because they're both composed of nervous tissue. To be clear, we've talked about in previous videos ADH and oxytocin, which are released from the posterior pituitary. ADH is antidiuretic hormone, which regulates fluid volume in the body. Oxytocin, among other things, induces uterine contractions during childbirth. These are both neurohormones. Neuro because they're released from nervous tissue, but hormones because once they are released, they go directly into the bloodstream. And that's what hormones do. They travel through the bloodstream. So if we go back to the anterior pituitary, all of these hormones in the anterior pituitary are released from epithelial tissue, and they move directly into the bloodstream to travel throughout their body and then activate only downstream cells that have receptors specific to these hormones. The hormones from the anterior pituitary are thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. We talked about those when we were talking in the previous video about the introduction to the endocrine system and female physiology and sexual reproduction. We also have growth hormone and prolactin. These are all abbreviations. I will put the long name of these at the end of this video. The hypothalamus also releases neurohormones, and all of these abbreviations up here are neurohormones, and they are going to stimulate the release of the hormones from the anterior pituitary. Because they are stimulating the release of these hormones from the anterior pituitary, we refer to these as tropic hormones. So we have growth hormone releasing hormone, we have gonadotropic releasing hormone. Growth hormone releasing hormone is going to stimulate the release of GH, otherwise known as growth hormone. Gonadotropic releasing hormone, GnRH, will stimulate the release of FSH and LH, because FSH and LH are the gonadotropic hormones. They are going to the gonads, the testes and the ovaries, stimulating the release of testosterone and estrogen. We have thyrotropin releasing hormone, which is going to stimulate the release of TSH, which is once again thyroid stimulating hormone. And we also have CRH, which is corticotropin releasing hormone, which will stimulate the release of ACTH. To be clear, all of these are traveling to the pituitary gland via the bloodstream. Because they are moving into the bloodstream and because they are being released from nervous tissue, we refer to them as neurohormones. Now, one may wonder why a blood vessel, a capillary bed, is required for these neurohormones to get to the pituitary gland, because that looks fairly close in proximity to the hypothalamus. Well, within our world, within the human world, and within our experience, yes, that's very close. I mean, the distance is something like that. But for a signaling molecule that's microscopic, super small, this is quite a long distance, and they cannot diffuse from the hypothalamus to the pituitary, or at least not effectively diffuse, because they may diffuse all over the region just outside of the brain. So they are utilizing a capillary bed, which we don't see right here, but please understand anything released from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary is certainly flowing through the bloodstream. Now, one of our main focuses on this video is going to be talking about the CRH, ACTH, cortisol axis. So to be clear, adrenocorticotropic hormone is stimulating the release from cortisol from the adrenal gland. And I'll talk in a moment more in detail on the adrenal gland. But CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, is going to stimulate the release of ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, from the anterior pituitary, which then will proceed to stimulate the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex. And then we'll also talk about the axis that involves TRH, TSH, and thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland, which we see right up here. TRH stimulates the release of TSH from the anterior pituitary. TSH then travels through the blood to the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. So let's take a look at the adrenal gland. To be very clear, the adrenal gland, as I have it drawn, is nowhere near the pituitary gland. The adrenal gland sits right on top of the kidneys, which are roughly right here. I don't know if you can see this. It's actually back here in what's known as the retroperitoneal space. The adrenal glands sit atop or immediately superior to the kidneys. They are also known as the suprarenal gland because they sit immediately above the kidneys. The adrenal gland has two regions. The interior region is known as the adrenal medulla, and that's typical of many solid organs in the body. For example, the brain has an adrenal medulla. They don't have an adrenal medulla. The brain has a cerebral medulla and a cerebral cortex. So organs that are solid, the interior region is generally referred to as the medulla, and the exterior of it is known as the cortex. And that's no different for the adrenal gland, where in green here we have the adrenal cortex, and in purple is the adrenal medulla. Guess what type of tissue the adrenal medulla is composed of? You got it. Because it's in lavender, it's nervous tissue. This releases the catecholamines, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine. So those are going to be neurohormones because they're released from nervous tissue directly into the bloodstream. The adrenal cortex, like the anterior pituitary, is colored in green, so that should tell us this is epithelial tissue. And the adrenal cortex releases three broad categories of hormones: the sex steroids, the mineralocorticoids, and the glucocorticoids. All of these are steroid-based hormones. Because they are steroid-based hormones, the basis for the synthesis of all these hormones is the molecule cholesterol. Sex steroids are testosterone and estrogen. Mineralocorticoids, there's a lot of different mineralocorticoids, but the main one we'll talk about is aldosterone. We will not talk about it in this lecture, but I will talk about it in subsequent lectures, probably relating to the renal system or the kidneys. And then we have glucocorticoids. The predominant glucocorticoid is cortisol. And cortisol, among other things, is going to regulate glucose levels in the blood, hence the term glucocorticoid. Corti is referring to cortex, oid referring to steroid. So we have corticoids, steroids. So once again, the release from CRH from the hypothalamus stimulates the release of ACTH from the anterior pituitary, which is going to stimulate the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex. So in a moment here, we'll talk about what cortisol actually does, but let's talk about the thyroid gland. To be clear, the thyroid gland is not to the left, or probably in your position to the right of the pituitary gland. The thyroid gland sits right here in the neck. It's a butterfly-shaped organ. This is the anterior view of the thyroid gland. This is the posterior view of the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland releases thyroid hormone. There's two different versions of thyroid hormone: tetraiodothyronine, triiodothyronine, but for our purposes, they're the same, and they are essentially the same, and we're just referred to it as thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is an amphipathic molecule, and we've used that term previously to talk about or to describe the phospholipids of cell membranes, which are amphipathic. They have a polar region and a nonpolar region. The nonpolar region of thyroid hormone allows this hormone to squeak through the plasma membrane unimpeded and without a channel. So the receptors for thyroid hormone are within the cytoplasm of the cell or even within the nucleus of the cell. Keep in mind, most protein-based hormones, the receptors on the outside of the cell, on the extracellular fluid side of the cell. Thyroid hormone is going to impact metabolic activity. So if we look right here, thyroid hormone increases metabolism in the body. Metabolism is any chemical reaction in the body, and that can be broken down into catabolic reactions and anabolic reactions. Catabolic reactions break molecules down, anabolic reactions build things up. So this is going to be achieved in a number of ways, but one thing that's going to happen when thyroid hormone is released, it's going to increase the size of the mitochondria and increase the number of the mitochondria, so more ATP is produced. Anytime metabolic activity is happening, specifically anabolic reactions, energy is required. It's also going to help increase the sodium-potassium pump, the numbers of the sodium-potassium pump, so we can maintain those concentration gradients of the cells. It's going to facilitate glucose absorption. The word absorption is suggesting movement of digestive contents from the intestines into our bloodstream so we can utilize it. So when we eat a cheeseburger, we break it down. There's proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, among minerals and vitamins, depending on where you get the cheeseburger. But all of the building blocks of those macromolecules are then absorbed from the small intestine into the bloodstream. That is what absorption means, and thyroid hormone will increase glucose absorption and as a result increase blood glucose concentrations. It's also going to increase protein synthesis, and that's going to be important because the sodium-potassium pump is a protein. The electron transport chain of the mitochondria utilizes a number of different proteins. Gluconeogenesis is increased. Gluconeogenesis is the production of glucose from non-carbohydrate substrates, such as proteins and fats, specifically the fatty acids and the amino acids. Okay, so that's a lot. Once again, thyroid hormone increases metabolic activity. When you think of metabolic activity, you should always have at the forefront of your consciousness cellular respiration. C6H12 plus 6 oxygen gives us 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water, ATP, and heat. So what happens to an individual who is hypothyroid? That is to say, they are not producing enough thyroid hormone. Well, a number of things. One, they become lethargic because they're not producing enough ATP. Two, they become cold because they are not producing this byproduct of cellular respiration known as heat. So they're not producing enough ATP and they're not producing enough heat. They are lethargic and cold. In addition to that, individuals with hypothyroidism, whichever form it's going to be, is not breaking down or utilizing this glucose. And all of that glucose will be converted to fat, and those individuals will gain weight. So they gain weight, they're lethargic, and they're cold. So while we're talking about the thyroid gland, there are two hormones physically related to the thyroid gland but have nothing to do with thyroid hormone. When I say physically related, they are connected to the thyroid gland. On the anterior side of the thyroid gland, we have these in red here, that's representing a parafollicular cell that releases the hormone calcitonin. And calcitonin, along with another hormone known as parathyroid hormone, are regulating blood calcium levels. So the way I remember this, when there is elevated calcium in our blood, calcitonin is released. And I always envision this L in calcitonin as an arrow pointing up. And that arrow pointing up reminds me that calcitonin is released when there is elevated or too much calcium in our blood plasma, and our body needs to do something with that calcium. Parathyroid hormone, on the other hand, is released from the parathyroid glands, and it's released when there is diminished blood calcium concentrations. This is the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland, and these parathyroid glands are sitting on the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. Now, what does parathyroid hormone do to increase our blood calcium levels? It's going to increase calcium reabsorption, it's going to increase bone resorption, and increase calcium absorption. And I realize that these three terms, reabsorption, resorption, and absorption, all sound very, very, very similar, but they are not. So to be clear, calcium absorption, just like we were talking over here with the thyroid gland and glucose absorption, calcium absorption is movement of calcium from the small intestines into the bloodstream. And certainly that's aided by calcitriol or vitamin D3. We've talked about that in a previous video. So parathyroid hormone will stimulate the calcium absorption from the small intestines. Now that is absorption. The kidneys, the functional unit of the kidneys is a structure known as the nephron. And the nephron filters blood, gets rid of things from blood that we don't need. Our blood plasma is filtered 60 times per day by these nephrons. There's roughly 2 million nephrons between the two kidneys. And one thing that nephrons do is they reabsorb things that should not be excreted from the body and put it back into our bloodstream. So things are filtered, taken out of the blood, and then put immediately back into the blood because our nephrons in our body decides actually we need those things, so put them back into the blood. That process is reabsorption, calcium reabsorption. So when the nephrons of the kidney filter out calcium, then they immediately, that is to say in the presence of parathyroid hormone, otherwise known as PTH, in the presence of PTH, that will stimulate the nephrons to increase calcium reabsorption. So both calcium reabsorption and calcium absorption are going to increase blood calcium concentrations. And it also increases resorption of bone. That is breaking bone down. Our bones store calcium. Now certainly our bones need calcium to mineralize the bone and to make the bone nice and hard, but we can grab calcium from our bones in times of need. And if we have diminished calcium levels, diminished blood calcium concentration, then the breakdown of bone, which is known as bone resorption, is that taking calcium from the bone and putting it in the blood. So these three things right here are what parathyroid hormone, otherwise known as PTH, stimulate to happen. What does calcitonin do? Well, essentially the reverse. Instead of calcium reabsorption, calcitonin is stimulating excretion of calcium from the kidneys, putting it into our urine. Once again, why is it doing that? Because remember, this arrow going up is telling us there's elevated blood calcium. So it's going to tell the kidneys and the nephrons to actually get rid of or excrete that calcium, eliminate it from the body. It is also going to minimize calcium absorption from the small intestines because we have sufficient amount of calcium in the body. Now, how is parathyroid hormone released? Well, let's look at this cell right here. This cell right here is representing a cell of the parathyroid gland. And in blue here, these are calcium receptors, and we see calcium bound to these receptors. Within this secretory vesicle right here, that is parathyroid hormone. So parathyroid hormone is sequestered within the secretory vesicles until it is stimulated to be released. And that stimulus is going to be activated by a G protein linked receptor and inducing a whole cascade of events that ultimately releases parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland. So when there is sufficient blood calcium in the blood, the calcium is bound to all of these receptors. But if there is diminished levels of calcium in the blood, there is no longer a saturation of these receptors by calcium. And it's going to look something like this. Okay, so looking at this, we still have one calcium bound to the receptors, but these other receptors no longer have calcium bound to it. So that's essentially telling the parathyroid gland that we need to release parathyroid hormone. And this receptor is a G protein linked receptor. The G protein, the whole cascade of events initiated by the liberation or the activation of the G protein, is achieved actually when calcium is not bound to the receptor. In this case, calcium can be considered a ligand. It's not a molecule, but it's a signaling ion. But the lack of calcium is what's going to activate the G protein, which is on the interior, because that's the receptor. It's a G protein linked receptor, and it's going to initiate a whole cascade of events, and the ultimate outcome of the cascade of events is going to be the release of parathyroid hormone from these cells via exocytosis. Okay, let's talk about the effects of cortisol. Cortisol is a very significant hormone. I want to read you an excerpt from this medical physiology textbook. To be clear, this textbook is the Guyton and Hall medical physiology textbook. It is a very thick textbook, as you can see. So if you're into thick books, you're going to love this book. It's very dense. There's a lot of good material in it. But I'm just going to read this to you, and I'm intrigued by the verbiage used in this first paragraph here. And to be clear, this medical physiology textbook first came out in 1956. It's currently still in production, and there's current editions of this. But I suspect the wording of this originates from many years ago. And once again, this has to do with the importance of cortisol in the body. Even though mineral corticoids can save the life of an acutely adrenalectomized animal, that is an animal that has had the adrenal gland removed, the animal still is far from normal. Instead, its metabolic systems for utilization of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats remain considerably deranged. Furthermore, the animal cannot resist different types of physical or even mental stress, and minor illnesses such as respiratory tract infections can lead to death. Therefore, the glucocorticoids, and that's really referring to cortisol, or hydrocortisone is the official name of cortisol. Therefore, the glucocorticoids have functions just as important to the long continued life of an animal as those of other hormones. So once again, this is from the Guyton and Hall medical physiology textbook. I reference this textbook a lot. I also reference this textbook a lot. This is Human Physiology by D. Unglaub Silverthorne. It's a wonderful textbook. Both these textbooks are quite detailed, so depending on your interest in physiology, they may or may not be suited for you. But just so you know, a lot of my knowledge comes from those two textbooks. So the purpose of cortisol is multifaceted, but one thing it's going to do, it's going to increase blood glucose concentrations, and it's going to achieve this a number of ways. One, it's going to stimulate gluconeogenesis. I think we talked about gluconeogenesis just a few minutes ago, but to be clear, production of glucose from non-carbohydrate substrates, so proteins and fats. And by stimulating gluconeogenesis, we are saving that glucose for more important times where we absolutely need that glucose. To be clear, cortisol is released during times of stress. That's due to an infection, any sort of trauma, and that trauma can be physical or even mental, or I should say emotional trauma. It mobilizes cortisol stimulates the mobilization of amino acids and fatty acids into the blood, because those are going to be used for gluconeogenesis to save our blood glucose levels. There tends to be such high blood glucose during the release or constant release of cortisol that it is often described as adrenal diabetes, because diabetes is characterized, among other things, by hyperglycemia, that is to say, elevated blood glucose concentrations. It's going to decrease protein synthesis, that is production of proteins, and it's doing that because we want to use those amino acids for gluconeogenesis. It's also going to increase the production of creatine phosphate, ATP, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, guanosine triphosphate, and coenzyme A. All of these should sound very familiar to you if you've watched the video on cellular respiration, because all of these, with the exception of GTP and maybe even GTP and creatine phosphate are involved in the grand multi-step process of cellular respiration. Cortisol is going to decrease inflammation, and that can be a good thing because inflammation caused by our immune system sometimes is as problematic as the original infection. And it's going to do that by decreasing vasodilation of our capillary beds. It's going to also do that by decreasing capillary permeability. Vasodilation of our capillaries or of our small arterioles allow more blood and more fluid to move to the tissues, and that's going to induce, or one of the factors that induce inflammation. Also, capillary permeability allows proteins, plasma proteins, to squeeze out of the capillaries. Water's going to chase those proteins via the process of osmosis, and that's going to be a major factor in causing inflammation. And another part of that inflammation is mobilization of white blood cells, and cortisol diminishes the mobilization of those white blood cells. It also causes atrophy of our lymphatic or lymphoid tissue, tissues that are highly concentrated in white blood cells. So this can certainly be very problematic because if it's breaking down the lymphatic tissue, then there's not as many white blood cells there to fight any sort of infection. But that can be actually a good thing when we're talking about transplants. If we're talking about any sort of organ transplant, a heart transplant, a kidney transplant, skin transplant, whatever it is, those individuals who have a transplanted tissue into their body, they're given cortisol, and they're given cortisol to knock out these white blood cells that may otherwise attack that transplanted tissue. So the atrophy of lymphatic tissue is both good and bad depending on the situation. It causes polycythemia, which is an increase in the red blood cell content of our blood. And on the face of it, that sounds really cool. Maybe if you're an endurance athlete, it sounds super cool. But the problem with that, it increases the viscosity of our blood. So instead of the blood flowing very smoothly through our blood vessels, it's more sluggish, kind of like honey. And that's not how we want our blood to flow. So there's pros and cons to the effects of cortisol. Now, we're going to get back to the tapering aspects of cortisol, but let's talk about the feedback loops related to the hypothalamus-pituitary axis. So right here, this is representing the hypothalamus. This is representing the anterior pituitary. And then we have the two downstream organs that we've been talking about, the thyroid gland on the left and the adrenal gland on the right, specifically the adrenal cortex. In review, TRH from the hypothalamus stimulates the release of TSH from the anterior pituitary, which releases thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland. We've talked about negative feedback, and negative feedback ultimately happens when the downstream response shuts off the initial stimulus for the process. For example, if our body is cold, we start shivering, the shivering increases body temperature, then it shuts everything off and our muscles stop shivering. So once again, the endocrine system, specifically the axis for the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary and whatever downstream gland or organ we're working with, in this case, the thyroid gland and the adrenal cortex, has two negative feedback loops. Our classic one, let's say, increased size and number of mitochondria, are going to tell the hypothalamus to stop releasing TRH and the anterior pituitary to stop releasing TSH. And certainly the thyroid gland to stop releasing thyroid hormone. That's our classic negative feedback, where the downstream response is providing information that we don't need any more of that signaling molecule released. Same thing applies over here. Elevated levels of cortisol, or let me rephrase this, elevated levels of glucose is going to inform this whole axis. We don't need any more cortisol release from the adrenal cortex. We don't need any more ACTH release from the anterior pituitary or CRH release from the hypothalamus. But we do have the endocrine feedback loop that's in play as well. And what happens, in this case, thyroid hormone travels through the blood. That's why I have it in red. Thyroid hormone, elevated levels of thyroid hormone in the blood are going to provide negative feedback to the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus to tell them to stop releasing TSH and TRH respectively. That is to say, enough of thyroid hormone in the blood is going to tell these two glands to stop releasing their tropic hormones, TRH and TSH. The same thing happens with cortisol. That's the long loop negative feedback. The short loop is elevated levels of TSH feed back onto the hypothalamus to tell the hypothalamus to stop releasing TRH. So we have a long loop endocrine feedback and a short loop. The short loop for this axis, the CRH, ACTH, cortisol axis, the short loop is ACTH, elevated levels of ACTH in the blood are informing the hypothalamus to stop releasing CRH. The long loop are elevated levels of cortisol in the blood that inform both the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus to stop releasing ACTH and CRH respectively.